Experiential 2014. I am Jenny Liu, one of the instructors for the transportation seminar, and Professor Monsieur back there is the instructor for civil engineering. And today we're very happy to have one of our own, Currans, and she is a PhD student in the civil engineering program, and she obtained her bachelor's from Oregon State University, also in civil engineering, and today she'll be talking about understanding where we live and how we travel, so I will turn over the floor to her.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. A little bit more about me. I did get my bachelor's from Oregon State, and I got my master's recently from Portland State. I'm currently a doctoral student and a Dwight David Eisenhower Fellow, and I work for Kelly Clifton, who is actually the principal investigator on the project that I'll be talking about. I'm not going to talk about the entire project because we've been working on it for, I guess, 3 years now. It's a fairly large project where we're really looking at where people would like to live, the types of neighborhoods, what they're looking for, and then the trade-offs they make in their transportation decisions. So I'm going to be talking about one specific area of that project, and it's the visual tool that we developed. The basic components of this visual tool was to give us an ability to relate neighborhood types through online surveys in a way that we haven't really been able to do before. So the presentation that I'm going to be talking about today is really that process of developing that tool, which represents different neighborhoods within our survey, the problems we had, the issues we had to deal with, and sort of what we came up with and how we're using it to look at residential and travel decisions. The basic outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we as transportation professionals tend to describe neighborhoods, and then also why images and visual tools can be useful for us when we're using them in surveys. I'll talk specifically about the process of developing our visual tool, and then give you some conclusions, some future work, some thoughts, and ways that we've used this. So engineers and planners typically talk about neighborhood and discrete attributes. These are your densities, your land use mixes. This might be measures of entropy, accessibility. There are more complicated measures like scale, floor to area ratio, but these categories don't always make sense to the general public. All of these categories, when we're talking about neighborhood, help us define the type of situations that we're seeing, whether you're downtown or in neighborhoods or you're in suburban or rural areas. And all of these elements can be combined together to help describe what we call the neighborhood bundle. It's all of the characteristics you get when you choose a neighborhood or you prefer a certain type of neighborhood. And so people who are not transportation professionals tend to look at neighborhood as these bundle of characteristics. They're not looking or deciding where to live based on numbers of density or how connected the streets are. It's really a combination of all of these things that they see all at once. And so one way that we can relate these complex relationships of all these variables is through the use of images, because people might not understand transit accessibility, but they might understand a photo of a bus. So there have been lots of people who use images for different types of surveys, and they've looked at how people interpret images. On one side, they use images to depict qualities that are really hard to describe, like human scale. They also use images to describe things like architecture, which might mean something different to different people. Do you know that your idea of traditional neighborhood is the same as the person next to you, how they see a traditional neighborhood? It's hard to know unless you have a photo saying this is what a traditional neighborhood looks like. We also use images and photos to describe concepts that are difficult for people to conceptualize. Planners might understand density, but it's hard to get that across to the general public, what an increase in density actually looks like. And then lastly, we can use these images to relate the complex arrangement, what a neighborhood is of all the elements together. So Jansen was one of the seminal papers that we used to sort of base this research off of. And their collective research says that there are really 7 reasons why you would use images in surveys instead of just text. And the main one that we base the fact that we would like our neighborhoods to be depicted with images is really that images can ground participants in a similar reality. That means, again, you might not see traditional neighborhoods as the same as your neighbor, but if we're showing you photos of a traditional neighborhood, then we know that you're all seeing the same thing. You might have biases of what that means. People see inner city neighborhoods and they might think more crime, but we know that when you see inner city neighborhoods, you're seeing the same land uses, the same scales. So the tool that we were developing, we're using for several different surveys, which we have already conducted, but I'm just talking about the tool today. And the basic structure of how we developed this was a 4-step process, which I'm going to walk you through now. So the first step is that we want to objectively define neighborhood. And what this means is that we're going to define neighborhood types like engineers and planners define neighborhood types. So we used a ubiquitous national data set, the SMART growth data set for students looking for data for their projects to define their neighborhoods. SMART growth database is pretty amazing. And we pulled out the 3Ds. We pulled out a measure of density, diversity, and design. And we used these 3 measures to categorize or classify neighborhood types for 25 MPOs in the United States. The tool we're developing is for Portland, but we wanted to get the universal scheme of the types of neighborhoods we're seeing in the top 25 MPOs for planning purposes, which I'll describe a little later. So for Portland and for Oregon, we only see 4 of the 6 neighborhoods that we classified in this objective exercise. C is the most urban that we see in Portland. We see a little bit of C in Eugene, but not very much. And C, as you can see down here, is mostly defining areas like where we are now. This is the most dense that we get. So in other areas of Oregon, this project is sponsored by ODOT, so we're looking not just regionally, but the whole statewide. We're seeing just a little bit of C in Eugene. And then areas around C, this light green D, is similar to the areas of inner east Portland here. So what this analysis is saying is that these inner east neighborhoods in Portland are similar to these sort of urban core areas in Eugene. And that's as far as the density, diversity, and design defines them. So once we have these 6 neighborhood types, we want to create image sets that help us describe each one of these 6 area types. We use Google Earth Street View, and we take screenshots of locations and places within each of these 6 neighborhood types. And that was honestly the most time-consuming part of this whole project, and I'm going to walk you through some of the thoughts and the problems that we've had through that process. We, first of all, wanted to incorporate not just photos of houses, not just photos of the things that people will live in, but also the things that support those houses and the residential areas. We're talking about the transportation network, different types of land uses and accessibilities, and then recreational options. What does a park look like in the suburbs, or what does a park look like in the most urban area in our definition? And then we also want to portray each of these 6 neighborhoods in the best possible light. As I'll walk through in a minute, there are lots of Google Street View photos of garbage, of trash cans, of lots of homeless people sleeping alongside resident or commercial areas. There are photos that don't really tell you anything. There are photos that you take in the middle of the road that don't really give you an idea of what the neighborhood is like. And so we wanted to eliminate those and really show in the best possible light what a suburban area can be described as, what an urban area can be described as. So we have these 6 neighborhood types that we've defined through the subjective analysis. And we only have 4 that we see in Oregon. But even in the most central part of the city, we want to plan and zone for increases in density. But how do we know what a C will look like in 20 years when it's actually more like a B? And when we do surveys and we want to give people options, we want to give them the option of living in a B. Where do we take photos in Portland of a B to represent those neighborhoods? So what we did to represent A and B was we looked outside of Portland to several different MPOs, and we tried to capture what Portland could look like in the event that we increase the density, the diversity of the design to a point in which we're no longer a C downtown, we're a B or an A. So the process of this was really an iterative one. We went on Google Earth within each of these neighborhood types, and we snapped 100 photos. And then we went back and we tried to look to eliminate things that might provide a significant cultural experience, that might identify areas as being unique to a region. So when we're looking at A and B in San Francisco, in New York, and Chicago, we're trying not to collect photos that would identify the Statue of Liberty as being part of that neighborhood type. And we're also trying to explicitly describe that place. And what that means is because there are lots of photos that are vague or that don't capture the essence of that neighborhood, we try and eliminate those or edit them in a way where we're focusing on the elements we're trying to get across to the people. So for one example, this is a shot of downtown near Powell's Books. So this is a C category. One thing we realized when we were looking in the really urban areas, and this was even more true for Chicago and New York, was that Google Street Cam really went through during the morning period before the rush hour began. And this makes sense for them to be able to capture and to make more ground. But for the photos, it meant that areas that were fairly active in the evenings weren't captured as being active. They were captured as being sort of empty or barren. So here's another shot. This is of whatever that fountain is outside of that place where you watch the plays. Keller, thank you. And this, in the summer, when it's nice out, is crowded. You have tons and tons of people there, but we weren't able to capture elements of this park as being a nice place to be around with lots of people and activity. So again, this is one where we debated whether or not we lose it. It is a park that shows an open space, but it looks like maybe you can't hang out there. Another problem we had with Google Street View is that it's a car-centric viewpoint, which means that the car that drove around can't tell you what it feels like to be there as a pedestrian or as a bike, necessarily as a bike. So we got lots of shots like this. Now this is near Pioneer Square. This is another C shot. But because you're from this viewpoint, you know, there's nobody there, it's morning. It looks like it's impossible to cross this road because you can't see on either side where you're going. The road takes up almost half the image there. So what we would do with this is we would either edit it or pick it at a different viewpoint where you could see down the road, you could see the train coming. You might see more people if you selected a different image to display this type of location. Another problem that we had, and this is a little harder for me to describe, is that within each neighborhood we want to put our best foot forward. We don't want to introduce a bias. If I don't like suburban areas, I don't want to introduce that bias there by picking very large, only large road shots, you know, no pedestrians and that sort of thing. We want to give a full representation of each neighborhood. And this is one photo that I think of constantly. It's because you have these wires going across, which some people think are ugly. I think they're kind of cool. And it's for what looks like maybe a bus. I think this might be in San Francisco. You have this really large road, which granted it's there, it's representing that neighborhood, but it looks as though there are some missing teeth in this landscape. We're talking about AB. This was an AB photo, so this is the most urban you'd see. But it looks like it could be a hotel and a convention center. It doesn't give you what it feels like to be in a very urban area. It feels like you're somewhere, you know, by a hotel and a convention center. So it doesn't adequately portray or depict the average characteristics of that neighborhood. Here's another photo of a C neighborhood. So this is downtown Portland again. And this is another photo that sort of depicts the same thing. It looks like there are missing teeth here. It looks like there aren't as much density or buildings as you would normally see. If you were to scan the photo a little bit to the left, there are more buildings. You have a museum of art, but the photo itself doesn't capture that. So if we wanted to capture this grocery store, we would likely zoom in, clip out some of the roads so that you get an idea of this is what an urban grocery store looks like, not this is 3/4 of the photo of a road. Another problem that we had and that we debated quite a bit was how much we should include people within these photos. When you take photos of the park that I showed you earlier, it looks much more barren than it does during a really high activity period. But when you include people in the photos, specifically when they're fairly close to the camera, it might tell you that this is a bikeable city or a bikeable roadway or neighborhood, but you also are introducing the bias of the respondent who's looking at the people and making impressions of the neighborhood by the people that are in it. So one thing we did within these photo sets was we went through and we tried to reframe the photos or eliminate shots of people who are so close up that you can really see who they are or what type of person they are. I mean, she's wearing jorts, so, you know, this looks like a hipster neighborhood, and it kind of is, but, you know, do we want to introduce that? So I'm not going to show you the videos because the videos did not work on my presentation, but I will show you some subsets of some of these neighborhoods. And because this is an urban school, I thought I'd start with neighborhood D. D represents inner East Portland mostly, but it also parts of Multnomah Village down to Salewood, I believe a little bit in St. John. So these are your historic districts, some of your slightly urban corridors, Alberta, things like that. Downtown Beaverton has a block group or two that is included there. And here we have a mix of photos, a subset of what was shown in the video to our survey respondents, but it depicts that you can live in a single-family home or a multifamily home. I clipped that photo wrong, but that's the whole height of the photo, so it's a low-rise, medium-family home is what people would see. You can park your car on the street. There's lots of street parking here. But you also have bike parking. We have a corral down there. We have activities that you can do. Here's a photo of a theater, although that is a fairly large landmark, and I think we got rid of that in one of our later versions. And then we have some photos of the type of land uses you might see, the little shops, the bars, things like that. If we move a little bit more urban to C, now we're talking about downtown Portland, you could see that the height of the buildings start to rise, but not necessarily all skyscrapers. We have down here an urban park. So this is another shot where it doesn't really show you the full level of activity that you would often see at Director's Park, but here's a public space. Right next to it to the right is another public space. That public space is very close to a building. I think that might be the art museum. And it gives you another idea of what the storefronts look like, what a grocery might look like. This is the same grocery in the photo I showed you earlier, but here it is clipped in a way where you can see the semi, mid-rise, high-rises behind it. You can see the vehicle activity there, the single person that's standing outside of it, and so on. The streetcar. In some of the other photos, we captured the max because there is max travel downtown. And then we moved to A and B. This is the most urban. Now, in some of our initial pilots, what we found was capturing A and capturing B in images was really hard for people to differentiate. In fact, it confused them. They thought we were trying to trick them. They thought we were trying to compare New York to San Francisco or something along those lines. So what we ended up doing was we combined AB as potentially what Portland might grow into, what the most urban we would see, the very downtown of Eugene or the makeup of downtown Portland might grow into. So our park area here, tons and tons of people. This is a fairly wide open space. We also have another park here, but you can see the high-rises and the buildings behind it. So these are urban parks versus, suburban or less urban parks. We did include some brownstones. Those we don't typically see in Portland, so that's a culturally or a regionally significant thing that Portland will probably not see because they are historic. But it gives you an idea of the density. These are single-family homes that are attached. These are not your detached homes with little yards in front of them and so on. We also captured taxis because taxis in bigger cities mean more within the transportation network. The most difficult thing we had capturing in AB categories was actually light rail transit because it's all subways. In all those major cities, it's subterranean. We included some photos of subway entrances, but it's sort of debatable if somebody's living in just outside of Hillsborough, are they going to know what an entrance to a subway is or that that's what that is? Is that going to identify with them? We don't know. So certain elements of the transportation network were very hard to capture in some of these photos. So we had our image sets, and they were in the form of these videos. Where it's sort of like a photo album flipping through, and we wanted to validate them. What we wanted to make sure is that respondents in these surveys can watch these videos, can see these images, and they can tell that there's a difference. They can guess or know which one has higher levels of density, more transit access, better walkable areas, versus not being able to know that there's a difference. So this was the basis of the survey, one of our pilot surveys that we did to validate these images. And what we did was we randomly selected 2 neighborhood types. If we showed them A, B, we also showed them C. If we showed them D, we also showed them E. And we had them watch these videos and compare on 13 different characteristics. And the characteristics were pulled from the literature. So we had 2 videos, and these were about 30 seconds long, I think, was what we ended up with. And we have them watch them. And then we have them on a number of characteristics rank. So which, based on your general impressions, I think the wording is there, based on your general impressions of the neighborhoods, please indicate the neighborhood that you think is more likely to have larger private yards, greater variety of types of dwellings, better public transportation service. All of these are typical characteristics that you'd see in stated or revealed preference surveys where you're having people make trade-offs. And so we wanted to see, well, which one of these, when they're seeing these images, which one can they differentiate and which one can't they? So in general, respondents saw really easily differences in density, which means they could order the neighborhood types by these images in order of density, which was kind of a big finding because it's really hard to know what people who don't study this stuff see when they see photos. We again found that it was really hard to portray a transportation network in static images. And part of this is because it's hard to capture light rail and buses in motion. It was hard to find photos of any type of transit. It was hard to find photos of bikers or pedestrians because it was, a lot of this was collected in early morning, and then they were either way too close to the car or you couldn't really tell that it was a bike. We also found that the images really needed to be supported with text. So the images ground them in the fact that they are looking at these different neighborhoods. They are grounded in the fact that this is a suburban and this is what a suburban neighborhood looks like. But they had trouble distinguishing certain characteristics. So we found support that what they needed was supplementary text to emphasize the characteristics that you wanted them to see or think about when they're making these trade-offs or decisions. And then we also found that the very urban neighborhood types and the very exurban, E and B, in general, people had a hard time differentiating those area types. So E just looked a lot like F, and A, B, and C just kind of looked a lot to each other. They could tell density apart, but on most of the other characteristics, they had a lot of trouble. Lastly, one thing we found in part of our pilot was that priming the pump is very, very important when you're using images for anything. So if you want them to be thinking about densities, you need to ask them questions about density early on in the survey so that they're already thinking about, well, this is density, or this is what a high-rise looks like, this is what a mid-rise looks like, and so on. Because otherwise, you're actually going to confuse them. They're not, when you ask them, when you show you the image or you give them a statistic or high-rise or some sort of decision, they're not going to really know what they mean. And within our pilot, we found lots of people would say that. They'd say, well, I found myself wondering, like, well, what does this mean when you ask about it? So priming the pump, giving them visuals early on is often a good way to get them on the page of what you want them to think about. We also took these visuals and we applied them in some surveys. And so the type of surveys we're really looking at are stated choice experiments, which is where we're presenting the respondent with sets of hypothetical options, and we're asking them to choose. So we're asking them to choose between neighborhood C and D, and then neighborhood A, B, and F. And we're giving them attributes, and we might give them other choices to make, like transportation choices. And the output of this gives us the ability to model not just what is their revealed preference, but if a new land use or a new neighborhood becomes an option to them, would they use it? So that's the basis of why we're doing a stated choice experiment within this survey, is to assess the trade-offs that people would make given that they have a new option presented to them, given that we grow C into a B or an A type neighborhood. Would they use it? Let's see. Yeah, good enough. So traditional stated choice experiments are often presented something like this. So this is one example taken from a textbook. And here they're given what looks like maybe 2 or 4 options to take on their trip somewhere. And they're asked, here you have it costs this much and it takes this much time. And option B costs this much and it takes this much time. Which one do you choose? In another example of an online survey, and I think this was in Australia, they're given a trip that they make, and they're given the characteristics there, and they say, here's another option and here's another option. If you knew all this information, would you change your trip? The problem with doing this in this sort of quantitative numbers way is that when you're asking people about neighborhood, it's really hard to get across what neighborhood is in text. And so the intent with our visual tool is to incorporate these visuals with some descriptions, within our stated choice experiment. So we conducted our experiment over the summer, and the basis of what people saw after we asked them a whole bunch of questions, we primed the pump like you wouldn't believe, and we gave them this type of option. So they would see 2 cards like this. Each card has a neighborhood on it, and each card has a commute option. So on the left, you have a central district, which is what we called AB. So we gave it kind of like a name so that they could look at it. They could click the photos, and the photos expand within the survey so they can really look at what central district looks like. And then we gave them a commute option. And so for this card, we presented them with a public transit commute that would take 15 minutes. And we asked them to pick whether they would live in the central district with that commute or whether they would live in the urban residential district where they would have to walk or bike, but it would take 30 minutes. And we said, of these 2 options, which would be most appealing to you? So they don't have to want to live in either of these, but we forced them to pick one of these options. So we did this last summer, and we used it in Qualtrics. So many of you are students, and I don't know if you know this, but Qualtrics is an online survey application, and you all have free access to it, which means you can all create your own fun surveys with your own fun graphics, and you could administer it like you wouldn't believe. So we administered that this summer, and we did supplement our photos with some text options that help describe each neighborhood, specifically so that we could get people thinking about the things we wanted them to look at most. Their access, their accessibility to retail and service land uses, what their parking would look like if they lived in that neighborhood, what their transit access would look like if they lived in that neighborhood. And here we're analyzing, or we're attempting to analyze, the trade-offs people made when they're deciding where they live for their travel characteristics of non-work travel, and then also with their travel characteristics of work travel, their commute. The cards that we developed here are actually static images that we embedded within our survey. And what this means is that you use HTML to edit your Qualtrics. Kelly really wanted me to emphasize this. We can get you all using Qualtrics here soon. So it really allowed, the HTML allowed users to sort of play with the images. You could embed other things that might be more interactive for them to sort of scan the images or examine them more closely. Yeah, so that was the basis of that survey, and we're hoping maybe next year sometime to present the actual findings as we finish the analysis. But in general, I just wanted to cover some of the lessons that we learned, the conclusions that we had when we were developing this visual tool. It's not as easy as you would think to represent something with photos. You're introducing what could be a lot of bias. You're introducing what could be a lot of confusion if people don't know what they're looking at. So if you're planning something like that, take a lot of time to think about it. In conclusion, we did develop this set of neighborhoods that are representative of nationally available neighborhoods. We constructed visuals representing all the neighborhoods that are available in Oregon, so those general neighborhood types that are available in Oregon. And then we also constructed a hypothetical visual tool for the neighborhoods that Oregon does not yet have. This is why it's so important in stated preference to have that option of what it could be. The main conclusion is that we find that visuals, in addition to text, are really beneficial in relating really complex topics to a non-technical audience, getting across many dimensions of characteristics that you want them to have. But that doesn't mean that you can't not have text, too, if you want them to focus on specific topics. In our pilot survey, one of the most important things we found, as I mentioned earlier, was to prime the pump, especially with the images and the text. This is really important when you're trying to get at something that's more complicated or uses specific language, like living space, when we want people to think about how big their living space is. That was a question we had to define and bring up over and over again to get people thinking about what that means. We also found that, in general, in most of our pilots, the respondents just had a hard time seeing differences in transportation qualities to neighboring neighborhoods. So they had a lot of trouble specifically with bike and walk, which may have been a result of using car-centric based photo set. So supplementing something like Google Earth with hand-collected photos might help in differentiating those visual tools. And then again, that very urban and very exurban neighborhoods looked very similar. We have like 100 questions from this analysis. It was actually really hard to stop, because this was not what we had funding for. This is just what we were doing to test this as a visual tool. And we wonder a lot, what would the impact of one photo have on the ability to see something like transit in this visual tool? If we were to include one more photo, or we were to swap out one extra photo, what would that be? So that would be a great question for like a master's thesis. We also didn't have a big enough sample to really examine how people are seeing these visual tools with respect to what their background is. It would be really interesting to see or compare higher income individuals with lower income individuals and how they're interpreting these environments, or this visual representation of these environments. And we also have a series of analyses that we're doing related to the stated preference work we're doing. We have a revealed preference analysis that we're almost done with. We have some more advanced techniques where we're having them analyze trade-offs. And then eventually we would like to incorporate the visual tool into other surveys so we could look at more advanced analysis to examine something more than just a simple trade-off between commute and neighborhood type. So in general, this was funded by ODOT and NITSE. It was a fairly long study. It was like 3 or 4 years. So, but then it was also funded by my fellowship, the Dwight David Eisenhower, which is a FHWA fellowship. So I think open it to questions. Does that sound good? Yeah.
So I guess, well, I applaud you for kind of highlighting the visual importance as opposed to just like looking at qualitative measures of environment. I would maybe kind of go a step further and say actually experiential.
Yeah.
It's more than just seeing an area. Mm-hmm. It's how you feel going through it and how you feel going through it at different times.
Yeah.
But yeah, that being said, I'm going to be a little critical, and I'm going to ask, well, I kind of feel that this is almost a solution in search of a problem. And I guess I asked the question of how is this work different from what an urban designer on a project would do? On really any project.
This could be something that people have already done. The problem with our research is that is typically things that are private, and they would not share with us. So in some instances, we would love to use the tool Envision to do some of this. So Envision, and I'm hoping I'm getting this right, is, who is that by? I can never remember the name. Friganesi and Associates. So they have this tool Envision, and one thing they've done with a lot of their public interactions is they take photos of places that exist where people can place themselves in, and they wipe it of cultural characteristics. So they have people who do Photoshop and are way better at that than I could ever be. And they create an environment that grows within the visual eyes of the participant. So they can see that street on Barber, what it would look like if they increased the density, and so on. And they use that and their tool Envision, which is more of a technical modeling tool, to get the public on the same page with specific projects. The problem that we had using that is that those are typically very specific. Those tools and that setup that they have is specific to those projects, so that's why you would hire somebody like Friganese and Associates to do that sort of thing. And the tool that we're looking at building needs to be more flexible, because we, with ODOT, intend to incorporate these tools and what we've learned in series of analyses and surveys. So it has to be more flexible so that it can represent more, not so specific to one project, for sort of a larger policy questions, not specific to one project. But those are beneficial.
But by allowing that flexibility, you're taking out
Yeah.
the important things of how we really experience the space, such as, taking out the icons or the context.
Mm-hmm.
That's what defines the space. That's how we experience
Yeah.
it. And it's just taking that out, taking out landmarks, taking out people.
But it depends on your question. We're not asking people, are you comfortable walking through here, or could you see yourself living in this? We're taking our analysis and our questions like 2 steps back from that, if that makes sense. The most ideal research project would be to take somebody from who knows where and walk them through a neighborhood and qualitatively ask, like, what are you feeling right now? What are the problems? What are you seeing? But who has the money for that? So this is one tool to answer a suite of a type of questions, but it doesn't solve every answer. But that's a great topic, yeah. Yeah?
I like the abstractness, but I was just curious, why did you limit yourself to Google Images? Why not just go over to Kelly Mountain?
It was mainly the availability of them. Our other thought was that we would want to supplement with hand-selected photos, specifically to get at the bike and pet environments, to be able to represent those in these tools. But then you get in the lines of you have to be there to take them, and we just didn't have the funds for that, at least not at this stage.
So we're curious about the Keller Mountain one. Why not just walk over during the day and snap one with people at it?
Mm-hmm. That was part of our problem was, who was doing the work and their availability to do something like that. We wanted to be consistent, so we didn't want to introduce bias in some ways. I mean, we had thought about that, but we stuck with the Google Earth images mainly so that we were introducing, only one type of photo. But you're right, like that would be a great option, and it would be nice if we go to other bigger cities to take photos like that, and we could frame them a lot better than the screenshots. Yeah?
So I was wondering about, Robert Chapler, about your survey responders, how you kind of like got the survey out to them, and
sure.
if you think it looks like an internet survey, so one thing that comes to mind is like underrepresentation or overrepresentation of certain demographics.
Yeah. We used, in the survey that I talked about here, and then the survey we did this summer, we piloted postcards that we sent out to random addresses within the region. For the survey I mentioned and sort of discussed, we did a stratified random sampling of households within certain zip codes. And then we asked them to go online. We provided an incentive, win one of 3 gift cards to Amazon. In general, for our larger survey, so when we were just validating the visual tools, we didn't get a very large sample. It was something like 130, 140 full responses. In our larger survey, we sent out close to 15,000 postcards, and we had about a 5% response rate. So we had just over 1,100 people respond. The demographics from those responses were representative of the Portland region. We sent them out to other people in Oregon, which meant that it was like income was slightly higher than the median income of Oregon, but it was representative of like a Portland metro area. In the validation survey, we didn't get enough to really look at that. It wasn't a full representation. But again, that wasn't the purpose of the larger project, so we didn't have the funds to do a larger thing. Yeah.
Certain demographic groups have a higher response rate for the postcards.
Mm-hmm.
Which groups tended to mail them back more?
So because the larger survey was representative of the region, it doesn't look like we have any huge bias as far as the variables that we collected. Their income, vehicle ownership was similar, number of children, household size was similar. So that is not necessarily biased based on what we've looked at so far.
Some neighborhoods are probably kind of like a lower income than others. So.
Right, but based on looking at the income of our survey sample and comparing it to the population, it's similar, which means that we're not seeing a higher response rate. I will say that we opened up an email for people to give us their questions and thoughts, and we got maybe 3 phone calls from people who didn't understand that it was online. They called and thought they had to take it over the phone. So we had a small, this is like less than 0.01% of our total sample had that issue, but as far as our larger sample statistics, it was similar to the population. Yes?
A couple online questions. So how does the cost of living in the certain neighborhoods factor into your survey? And then how about sort of access to schools or other?
Yeah. So as far as the access to schools goes, the quality of schools and the access to schools can change within a time period. So we weren't including that in this survey, specifically so that we're not introducing a factor that we can't predict in the future. So we're talking about larger travel demand models that the state uses to model statewide or regional residential location choice. As far as, what was the other question? Cost, right? So cost is sort of an interesting thing that we've been debating an awful lot within our research group. Within our stated preference survey, we didn't introduce cost as an attribute that varied for a number of reasons, a few of them being that in general, living in more urban area types is more expensive. We presented them with an average living space size so that they'd know relative across the neighborhood types how that would vary as a means for cost. So if you were to pay so much in a suburban area, it would get you this much space. That same amount of money in an urban area would get you this much space, and we let that stand. The problem with introducing cost for the purposes of what this survey would be used for within ODOT is that cost for housing changes over the years, and it's hard to predict that. And when you're introducing cost here and you're using those relationships within your model, and you don't have a supply-demand model that's more sensitive to changes in those environments, then you have issues with whether you're imposing what people decide today on the future. So we left cost per square foot, cost to rent versus own per month. So we left that out of our survey so that we can control for it in other ways within the larger models. Yeah?
You talked about having to kind of prime the pump and get them going. How did you avoid introducing any biases in that?
That's a great question. There's going to be bias within the survey, and you do have to use very careful language. This was part of the iterations that we had and the reason why we did several pilots of our larger study. One way would be we're asking them about what dwelling type they live in. So what's the structure of their building? And within each option, so they could live in a high rise that's so many stories, or a low rise that's so many, or what a detached single family house looks like compared with an attached single family house. And within each one of those options, we gave them streams of photos that represent each type in different forms. You know, what a mid-rise might look like with brick versus, you know, stainless steel or glass. The use of many different photos is really meant to eliminate, or you're never going to eliminate it, but sort of wash out the bias that people might get from looking at just one photo. So we're not trying to use one photo to define what a single-family house looks like, because people would say, well, that may be what your single-family house looks like, but mine looks nothing like that. That was one way that we tried to prime the pump without introducing bias. The other way was simply just to use language that we modified iteratively through pilots and responses to our surveys, so that when people get upset by things or when they think something's not right, they'll tell you. And so if you give them an option within your pilot to talk to you, and that was one thing that we had, where we would change the wording of the characteristics that we were asking about so that it was a little more smoother. We tried not to use words that emphasize income or bias of something being better than one another. It was that sort of edits that we made to it. But it was iterative. Yeah?
So you just answered half of the question I was going to ask. I was going to ask if you had a question on the survey asking where people live.
Mm-hmm.
So you also asked them, like, what are their current transportation choices?
Yeah.
Because that was the point of, like,
Yeah.
seeing if people had a difference between where they stayed, they went with, versus.
Right. The revealed versus stated preference.
Like,
Yeah.
think about that.
And that was part of the priming of the pump, too. We phrase things and we give them options in the beginning that are available at the end. We asked them, so we knew where they lived because we sent them a postcard. So we knew what neighborhood type. We asked them what neighborhood type they preferred. Some of the analysis we're doing now is just looking at that, just where they live now and what neighborhood and housing type they prefer based on a whole bunch of other things. We had them rank characteristics of neighborhood as being very important to them, being important but not deal breakers, and then not being important at all. And this was one topic where it was, safe. What is safety important to you? Is quality of schools important to you? Having a larger house or a bigger yard, or being close to your neighbor, being in the center of it all. That's one way that we started to introduce those topics that are much harder to get across.
Continue the study for like years later and see if people moved.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We would love to have funding to do that. That's sort of ideally how this tool would be used in the future. That you might modify the photos to capture the use of different types of land uses or things like that, but that you could see as years go on how these preferences change, how millennials age and how their preferences change, how boomers age and their preferences change, and whether or not you are like your cohort that's slightly older. Great. Yeah?
John Landau. I had a whole bunch of questions, but trying to whittle it down to one. Was there any tracking for, in terms of doing these surveys with pictures versus doing a survey with no pictures in terms of response rates, completion, survey fatigue?
No, we weren't testing, especially the latter ones, we weren't testing them without photos. Some of the priming the pump things that we did, we added photos because it was clear that people were not understanding the questions. We knew their address. You'd look it up. It'd be in a high-rise, and they'd say single family attached. So those sort of things changed as the survey pilot progressed. Let's see, what else do we do without photos? There is a lot of literature that says that photos are a great way of grounding the participants and seeing the same thing. The studies, if you're interested in this sort of thing, Susan Handy and Reed Ewing did one looking at perceptual qualities of the environment. This is your human scale and your enclosure and tree cover and all these things that are actually really hard for engineers and planners to quantify, like on a regional scale. It's hard to get the data to do that. But you can represent those things with photos, and that was one finding that they really found, which was interesting. But. Sure.
Hi, yeah. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more first about, the A through F of the land use at the beginning. Is there a calculation there? And then secondly, how this research might help with something like self-selection and understanding that better.
Okay. Well, so yeah, there was a process, and I didn't cover it at all because I didn't want to get too far into it. It's block group based, and that was because we used the Smart Growth database, which is nationally available. We wanted to capture more than just the Portland, Oregon region. But we looked at the 3 dimensions, the density, diversity, and design, and we categorized them into high, medium, low. So each block group was classified as a high, medium, low. And then we grouped similar categories within each of these 3 diversities to parcel out the A through F. We also explored factor cluster analysis of a larger set of variables, which is a common way to classify neighborhood types or environment types in the literature. But we wanted something simpler where it was more factor analysis is a little bit more complicated to understand, and we wanted something fairly simple where you simply bin neighborhoods into the categories. So I have a paper that we'll present at TRB that I can make available if you're interested in that. What was the other question? Well, self-selection, you need to ask more questions about their preferences and what they find important to see if they're within their neighborhood because they want to be there, or whether they'll move to a neighborhood, the latent demand for urban area types. That's the intent of that's part of the intent of some of the latter analysis that we haven't started yet. But it's really looking at where are people living where they really want to be living somewhere more dense or somewhere that's a little different. Where are people living where they want to live, and then where are people living where they don't want to live? And we did ask them their preferences for neighborhoods and household types. And I was somewhat surprised by the amount of people who, even though they lived in E and F, which in Portland would be, out toward Gresham or Hillsborough or things like that, were saying, yes, I want to live in D. Lots of people wanted to live in D. Not as much on C and AB, but that could be a sampling problem, which I won't get into. But yeah, so that's the intent of some of that latter analysis, which we haven't looked too far into.
Presentation today. Next week's presentation is